Hi, good afternoon. This is Loretta from Stone Beach Permaculture. We're here from somebody all the way from, I believe it's Florida. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm in South Florida, kind of really close to the tropical zone.
And we're here with Scott, and he's from WoodlandCravings, and his Instagram page is just absolutely beautiful. I will have the link to that page on our website, and it's just full of color, just absolutely beautiful. And one of the things you're quite interested in, from what I gather, is foraging, correct?
That is correct.
So could you tell our viewers a little bit about what foraging is to you?
Great. Foraging to me is something that I feel that I've always done since I was a little kid. It's something that I've tapped into. I think it's this primal reward thing. You know, you go into the forest or on a hike or on a walk somewhere, and it's like a treasure hunt every single time. And then when you find something that's fun or cool or edible, then you're receiving that endorphin rush, you're receiving this feeling of excitement, and then when it's food, the reward is just so much more meaningful. So, I mean, ever since I was a kid growing up in Florida, I would catch lizards or snakes or go look for cool rocks. So this hunter-gatherer mindset was always part of me ever since I was very young. And then as I came into my adult life and after going through my college degree with environmental sciences, the foraging and permaculture kind of became part of my whole lifestyle.
And that's how you went back into foraging. You experienced it as a child, and then all of a sudden you got back into it after college, correct?
Correct.
Oh, wow, it must have been a really interesting experience for you. It's always interesting to revisit childhood kind of experiences in a new way, in almost a more exciting way, I would say.
A much more exciting and educated and much more meaningful in this way. You know, as a child, you're just having fun, and then now I get to have fun but have a lot of meaning that goes behind it as well.
So for anybody interested in foraging in your area, I'm sure we have quite a few, we call them snowbirds. They go down to Florida for winter time. Do you have any books on the topic of foraging in your area?
So that's a tricky subject. Foraging in Florida can be quite difficult because of the amount of public access lands where foraging is allowed. So having friends who have private property or acreages, which I do, where I can go forage at times and look for things, because state parks, you know, there's laws that kind of prevent you from foraging. County parks, they don't really allow that either. So it's really having access to private lands in certain locations. But then there's always the chance of urban foraging, which you're in the urban environment. You know, you're near an area where there's a piece of land that's not owned by, say, the state or by a county park. So the urban foraging kind of becomes part of the landscape that you get to work with. Otherwise, going to national forests in Florida, which we have the Ocala National Forest in the center of the state, that's a great spot because since it is a national forest, foraging is looked at a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. And it's
as for a resource, when it comes to learning what is edible or foraging in this area, I would like to really give a shout out to people. One being Green Dean. He runs and operates the website Eat the Weeds, and that's a great resource. He's been foraging for many years, and I learned so much from utilizing that website to kind of gain identification and what things are used in food. And then another person is Andy Firk, and he's in the process, I believe, of writing for Florida foraging. And so he's building his book right now. And those are the two people that I've learned a lot of Florida foraging from because of, one, I've been to Andy Firk's talks, and two, I've been to Green Dean's website many of times to really learn what I'm going to forage for.
So if somebody in your area was interested in venturing off and going on a forage, what would you suggest their first steps be?
First step, if they're in the local area, they could contact me. I do lead guided hikes to educate people. We'll go to places that are parks and areas or urban environments, and we're not there to forage a bunch together, but I'm there to educate and teach what certain plants are, what they've been used for. I don't do forays, we call them forays for, say, mushrooms or for plants where you go out as a group and you forage together. I don't do that per se in Florida because of the little bit of the fine line that you have to really work with here in the state. But I do like to give the education aspect and then the historical aspect of, thanks to, say, our ancestors who have been on these lands a long time ago and have done all the trials and errors to know what is edible, what is toxic, what is medicinal. So the most important thing for any new forager would be to expose yourself to the experts, expose yourself to people who are doing these walks and talks, because going out alone is great. We can all start there, but it does take a little bit of an education for plant identification or for mushroom identification. Mm-hmm. There's no room for error per se, because you can get yourself sick very easily. So they say, if you're 99% sure that your idea is correct, throw it out. You need to be 100% positive with your ID before you consume anything, mm-hmm. say from the forest or from the woods. Because we don't want to get sick. Nobody wants to get sick or have a bellyache or, even worse, you can do yourself some harm just by a simple misidentification, which can happen very easily. So exposing yourself to the experts and utilizing resources from, say, the internet. The two names that I had mentioned are very great resources. My Instagram, my email address, those are all things where you can contact and ask me as well. Mm-hmm. And with plant identification, there's a Facebook group called Plant Identification where you can take a photo, post the picture on the on their community page, and you just say your location, and you have, I think there's 120,000 group members from all around the world, and it's like within minutes you'll have somebody, IDing your plant for you down to, to the scientific name. So there's different community pages that are really good resources as well. Now, when I was living in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, there were a lot of great resources for, edible mushroom books, edible plant books. That's been part of that lifestyle up there for a long time. And in Florida, we're kind of in the Stone Age a little bit still when it comes to foraging and utilizing nature in this way as shepherds and as tenants, and then also as a utilization of foods that we're provided with.
And that kind of touches on our next question. Before, you were talking about foraging in an urban area, and our next question is about, do people get excited, or are they very surprised finding out that they can forage wild edibles right in their backyards?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The excitement is always the best part, where people have said, "Man, I've looked at this my whole life. I always wondered what it was. That's really cool. So, and I got this right in my backyard." They'll say, So that's always really exciting. Or I'll point something out to someone. Say at the Permaculture project that I was part of for building and designing in my undergraduate research. And we'll have, to this day, students are still visiting the project and working on the project. And being that we're in South Florida area, there's a lot of diversity from so many different cultures and countries around the world, especially the Caribbean. I'll bring them to this project or show them this food, and they're like, "Oh man, I haven't had this since I was a little kid. I can't believe that I'm seeing this right now. I can't believe that I get to taste this right now." So whether it's, foraged foods or some of these tropical and subtropical fruit trees that we can grow here, the excitement for it being edible or connecting back to, say, childhoods is really cool to see. It's very rewarding when you get that excitement out of a person.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit about wild mushrooms. Now, you're in, I would say, a subtropical area, or to tropical?
Correct, yeah. We're right at the border. There's small little microclimates of tropical regions, but mm-hmm. mostly subtropical.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear that there's mushrooms there. Did you find a big difference between mushrooms from Oregon to mushrooms in Florida?
Absolutely. Big difference. Yes. The biodiversity of fungi in the Pacific Northwest is through the roof.
Wow.
Now, we do have biodiversity in fungi in Florida, but again, when it came to the research of edibility of certain species or mushrooms, it's lacking in a lot of places because I guess our climate, our ecosystem, and maybe even just the number of scientists or food enthusiasts hadn't really been in Florida for very long when it comes to these wild foraged goods, as well as the mushrooms. And having good resources for what is edible is very difficult. In Florida, though, what I have found for edible fungi are oyster mushrooms. It's the genus Pleurotus. And then we have chanterelles, which is Cantarellus for your genus. We also have a couple other mushrooms that are just not as popular for edibility. But I'll name one is like the Lactarius indigo. So it's a blue-colored mushroom in the Lactarius genus, and they are edible. They're slightly bitter. I think they have a little bit of a different taste, but with proper cooking and certain techniques, you can really work with some of the flavors that we have. So those are just a couple edible mushrooms. Now, when it comes to growing gourmet mushrooms in a controlled environment, the pink oyster mushrooms are a tropical species. That is Pleurotus jamor. It's DJAMOR. Those are the pink oyster mushrooms, and they come from those warmer climates. So when it comes to cultivation, those are really easy to work with down here.
And again, we touched a little bit on planting trees. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about what a food forest is?
Yes. So a food forest, after I learned about permaculture and putting everything together with my understanding, the way that I like to explain it is, think of the word permaculture. I'm sure many have heard this already. Permanent agriculture. Put two words together. It is something that you're trying to create a sustaining, permanent food forest. And food forest is mimicking any other forest. You're using ecology, and ecology is all the biodiversity coming together and working together to create this forest. So you have your canopy layer, you have your shrubs, you have your vines, ground covers. All these things encompass a forest. And then that's when you start bringing in, your insects and your fungi and your predators and your prey, and then you have apex predators. And so that's when you create this biodiverse ecosystem, and that to me is what creates a healthy food forest. And the food aspect is that you are using as many edible things that you can into this design. So here we did tropical and subtropical fruit trees, annual and perennial vegetables, as well as the introduction and planting of a lot of native species as well, with some of them being edible natives to the project too. That way you're bringing in so much more biomass and diversity. Pollinators of all different kinds are going to come into there, so you're going to have different options for different kinds of fruits, say the anonas, which are sugar apples and custard apples, which take a little bit more care to get them to pollinate. But if you have all this diversity of flowers, you might get the proper pollinators to come into the project to get everything pollinated really well for you. The food forest that I work with is located at Florida Gulf Coast University, and that was my senior research project in my undergraduate degree. We had spearheaded getting a campus garden, and we got support from our student government to get funding to build a half-acre food farm on campus, and we used all permaculture techniques. And to build it, we used all student volunteer labor. And so the amount of service by students at this project is going 7 years strong right now, because it started in May 2011. and we're now in 2018, so 7 straight years of student service, student leaders coming to this food forest, the half-acre plot on campus, to learn about permaculture, to learn about growing their own food, and it's really cool when somebody comes and says, I didn't know potatoes grew in the ground. I thought they grew on a vine on a fence. And so just these things that we have, these gaps, because of the way, we go to the grocery store, everything comes in plastic or everything comes all packaged and pretty. There's that gap of understanding even where a potato comes from. That was one of the first wow moments that I had when I was leading tours and leading student groups when I was working at the food forest while I was in my degree still. These wow moments of like, we are so disconnected from our food. Mm-hmm. This is really important to have this here.
So how would you suggest somebody become more connected with food? Just going on tours, or maybe people should go foraging a little bit more? What would you suggest?
It's always coming down to getting in contact or learning what's happening locally in your community. Mm-hmm. When it comes to if there's anybody leading guided foraging hikes, if there's permaculture projects occurring in your community, even if there's a local farm that's trying to do things more sustainably or organically or in a biodynamic way, exposing yourself to those things, because we're all in different locations in the U.S. or around the world. So to say where specifically to go, it really comes down to your local community, because once you meet a couple people that might be doing these things, they're going to have more information to share with you and resources available to you. That's the only way that I've ever learned anything, is just trying to get as involved as I can in my local community. Farmers markets are a great spot to go, because they're putting themselves in a location where people know to go look to buy their produce, but they're also there to communicate and maybe give some information on what else is happening locally. Mm-hmm. There's also different community centers that at times, when I was in Oregon, there was like the local Grange, and at the Granges, there was a lot of organizing going on where people had certain events happening with food or permaculture or foraging. Also, if there's any universities nearby to somebody, seeing if there's anything happening with the university within their environmental science department or their environmental studies department. Those are great ways to kind of get linked in. You don't have to be a student at a university to go to a talk at most campuses, because most of them are public universities.
So, going back to food forests, where can somebody likely find 1 or 2 food forests in Florida if they would like to go visit?
Okay, there's the Florida Gulf Coast University Food Forest. That is a resource that is very easy to access, and there's a lot of information on the fgcu.edu website with contact information. If there's tours going to be set up at times, it's all student run, so that's the great thing about it, is that students are teaching people and learning by being these student teachers as well. There's also a website called Echo. I'm going to double check real quick.
And these are just places you can, if any of our viewers are interested, they can go and see if they'd like to visit one in Florida, if they ever get the chance to.
Correct. And so in Fort Myers, Florida, the website is echonet.org, and that's ECHONET.org. And they're a great resource for learning. And what they do is that they try to fight world hunger, mm-hmm. and they do different missionary work around the country, around the world. The amount of research that they do, and they give tours every day. They have a farmer's market, so there's a lot of resource with them when it comes to permaculture and food forests. Now, they don't per se have food forest design in the ecosystem in the permaculture way, but they do have so much biodiversity and so much research going on. It really is inspiring to go see what they're doing, and that's what we did at the university when we built our food forest. We went to Echo very often to learn about different seeds or what grows in this climate, what grows in that climate. There's just a huge resource, and to have them so close to us during the build-up of our food forest, it was really beneficial. And then I want to mention, this is not a permaculture design place, but this is also a great botanical garden collection in Homestead, Florida. It's near the Miami area. It's a 38-acre tropical fruit collection. They have about 400 different edible fruit species, and it's called the Fruit and Spice Park in Homestead, Florida. I was an intern there and worked with Chris Rollins, who was the director at the time, and he had traveled all around the world collecting rare fruit species.
And touching back on the food forests, what type of gardening techniques are at work when you design a food forest?
Oh, wow, okay.
Sorry for that huge question.
Okay, so in Florida, we don't have very rich soil. We have sand, all sand. So that's a lot of soil amendments to start at first. Fortunately, when we started our food forest, we did get a large budget, and so rather than taking 5 years, 4 years to amend soils to get our production up quickly, we actually were able to put organic compost over the whole half acre to get us started rolling really quickly. So if you can amend your soils, that's the most important thing, especially if you're in the tropics or in a sandy location. That's key. You're not going to be able to provide the nutrients or the moisture content that the roots need for a lot of these tropical fruits in, say, southwest Florida, where we are, where it is, again, primarily a sand substrate. After the soil amendments come in, irrigation is another one. So drip irrigation is what we utilized at the food forest. And the water came from a pond, like a retention pond lake nearby. So we had an irrigation going into there. And that was kind of what we did to sustain the trees. Personally, I don't like to mess with many annual vegetables or fruits because it requires a lot of work. I am very into perennial fruit trees, perennial vegetables. I like the idea of a lot of input and work at first, and then everything sustains itself very easily, and all you need to do is do your proper pruning and hedging techniques to get the growth and, food forest that you're trying to go for. And then when it comes to some of these perennial vegetables, there are some that you can stick right into sand and water them a little bit, and they'll do just fine. And that's the best for me. I like the least amount of labor-intensive work to keep a sustaining food forest.
And it's not a new idea, food forests, am I right? I think human beings have had a really intimate bond with food forests. Is that correct?
Food forests are far earlier, before any industrial agriculture. This is how we as humans survived. We're creating food forests, because you think about, the story that I was told is that, in Southeast Asia, I believe they're called kampongs, and it's the little villages where folks would go into the forest, get their fruits and vegetables from the forest and the rainforest, come back to their villages, and they just start spitting seeds out their windows. Well, then the seeds started growing, so they're like, wow, well, we should just plant our food right next to our village rather than having to go into the scary jungle and have to worry about, predators coming for us. So the food forest kind of began with, these small villages and small communities utilizing their forests from foraging to food forests. And that's my favorite part about it, is that this idea of foraging is where we started getting the idea of food forests, and then agriculture, grew from all of that. So it really does tap into our historic indigenous roots and where things all began when it came to how we were going to sustain ourselves with food.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that food forests are the food production of the future?
Oh, that's a very big question. The way that I answer that and the way that I would love to see things change is that it would have to be a societal shift to have an agrocentric society, because without this agrocentric lifestyle and viewpoint, making it a way of the future is going to be very difficult, because many people live many different lives and not everybody wants to grow their own food. A lot of people like the convenience of just being able to go purchase and buy things, which is great. So I think having appropriate communities to do these food forests is going to be a potential way of the future. But to say that it could happen on a global scale to where everybody is doing it, I think that is asking for a lot. I do believe that we are all meant to live different lifestyles, and diversity is key in everything in life. So in creating food forests, there's always going to be surplus, so then we can provide food for those who don't want to grow their own food forests. So it's a delicate dance. I would love to think that it's going to be the way of the future, and it could be for many, but to say that it could be for the masses, it would be really hard to sustain New York City with food forests for the amount of people that say live there, with the availability of land available to grow food.
Mm-hmm. Well, if somebody were super interested in food forests, what would be your advice to them on how to start one of their own?
Well, understanding your local temperate zone, what can grow and can't grow there. There's a great book by Eric Tonesmeyer, and it's called Perennial Vegetables from A to Z. And that's a really great book for knowing what can grow around the United States based on your climate zones. Mm-hmm. And it really talks into the perennial aspect, because annuals you have to plant every 3 to 6 months, and it's very labor intensive. It's a lot of water. Perennials are, you plant them, they grow, they live for X amount of years. So I would suggest anybody that's interested in permaculture to look out what annual vegetables or fruit trees will grow, what perennial vegetables will grow in your area, and start with those. Those are the easier ones to start with. A lot of times they're not as easy to kill. Annuals are very, very susceptible to disease and to being killed very quickly. And I don't want to discourage anybody to, start annual beds and then, they kill off their whole bed and they're like, man, I'm not a good gardener. It's not about being good or bad. It's just, it takes time to really learn, feel the soil, get your hands in there, make mistakes. I didn't start with a green thumb. I started with a brown thumb, and then it turned into a green thumb. It just takes some trial and error. And again, utilizing local resources, because I can say what we can grow here in Southwest Florida, but to say what anybody can grow in the Northeast, mm-hmm. I really have no idea, because you have snow and frost and vegetables that we can't grow because it's too hot here, and they like the colder weather. Another big struggle for us down here is, one, like I said, the soil. Two, we don't have freezes and frosts, so the amount of pests that we have to deal with in the summertime, we don't have the winter to kill them off. So we do deal with a lot of struggles, but on the offset is that it's growing season all year round. Mm-hmm. We can grow things all the time, but we can't grow greens in the summertime, or leafy greens, other than these really cool tropical greens that as Americans we've never heard of. Chaya is one of them. That's Chaya. Nidosculus aconitifolius is the scientific name, but this is very common in Central America and South America, and it grows all summer long. It's a leafy green, but you have to boil the greens for 10 minutes to cook off any of the harmful properties to it. then you can consume it. And this is a green that I eat all the time. I absolutely love it. We call it tree spinach or chaya, and it's great. We can also grow something called edible leaf hibiscus. And it's these giant green leaves that are very soft, and they're wet. They have this kind of this, almost like this mucilaginous, I know it's a funny word, but mucilaginous moisture content, which is really nice because it's a wet green. But we can grow that in the summertime as well because it's our rainy season, so it loves the water and it loves the rain. But we can't grow lettuce heads and romaine and things like that, and we even have trouble growing your standard lettuces in the wintertime here in Florida. So again, growing a food forest is really all about knowing what you can do in your local area.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to our last question, which is, do you think that food forests of the future can coexist with humans? And how would you think that would happen?
Absolutely. We are all capable of creating community and creating spaces for food to grow. It's about, I think, inspiring people to try something different and to try something new, and also to learn how rewarding and fulfilling it is to feel what it's like to eat things that you've grown or things that you've foraged. There's really this endorphin rush that comes from growing your own food or foraging food. And the inspiring thing is that, through social media, it's a double-edged sword for sure, but now we have so much access to information. Thanks to technological advances, we can show each other photos. We can connect with somebody across the world that might be in the same climate and they're growing something you've never heard of, but you can find seeds at a local market and go and get it. I think that we have a huge opportunity to shift our mindset and shift our lifestyles to be this agro-centric food forest foraging community, but also doing it with care and consideration for those that aren't doing those things and still having respect for others. There's no ego or pride that should go into any of this and say that anybody is better than anyone else because I grow my own food or I forage my own food. It's not about ego or pride. It's about inspiring and showing connectivity to one another. We all, like I said, we all live different lifestyles, and that is the beauty of life, is diversity. So I think the biggest takeaway is do things with integrity, do things with a smile, and try to really inspire others to be part of that as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here in Ontario, southern Ontario. This was Scott from WoodlandCravings, and he can be found on Instagram by the same handle, WoodlandCravings. And thank you very much for joining us, Scott.
Thank you very much. I appreciated this, and it's really great to talk to you and your community.
Thank you so much.